So we're getting ready for our second panel of the day. So as you collect yourselves up and such, I'm just going to briefly mention this is on revolution and our whole history. So we're talking about the events that are going to be going and commemorated over the next several years, since that American Revolution took a long time. And we have Jordan Smith, Ian Mumpton, and Sarah Wasberg Johnson are going to be presenting on the theme of revolution and our whole history.
All right. So, NYS, Rahagwardizere, Gyatha, Ganya Gehaka, de Wagaf Nutna, Disnu, Jihregis, Asitda, Gakerdi Hadiati, Agunashani, not already walk, had to what a yet, Disnaneque, Agat Nerde, Thweru, Ithwidre, had Ithwit de Gihragif, Ha Askana. So, I just introduced myself in Tuscarora. My true name in the Gahngehaga language, or the Mohawk language, is Rahagwardizerde. It means that he drags a twig or a branch. I like to say branch because it's a little significantly bigger than a twig, right? But I'm a member of the Bear Clan. I reside on the Tuscarora Indian Reservation just outside of Niagara Falls, New York. I teach Haudenosaunee culture and history at Old Fort Niagara in Youngstown, New York, on the mouth of the Niagara. And I've been there for roughly 5 years, but I started my, I guess my interpretation journey probably about 15 years ago. I worked there for a summer, and I was able to not only share who we are culturally as far as songs and dances, because that's kind of my specialty, but I also was able to go through these historic documents and learn a lot. So really, my perspective to coming at this, the way we're going to interpret the American Revolution, really has to do with education ourselves, because a lot of the Native and Indigenous people in our communities currently aren't learning about those things. A lot of us are going to public school as well, so you know, we don't get the education that we all know is important in those history courses. Now, one of the things that I emphasize, as I said, I really emphasize on that singing and dancing, and I do that because it's one of the ways that I have learned to keep the attention of younger kids, teenagers, but also some adults that just may have that ADHD and are wandering off sometimes, you know. But it's one of the ways that you can visually see what the Indigenous people are currently doing. And now at Fort Niagara, the reason I like being there is because not only is the Great Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee have ties right to that area, the escarpment Jagonsase, she lives right there on the borders of the Tuscarora Reservation today. So our Confederacy has ties right to this area here, to the area of Old Fort Niagara, and all of these historical sites have some type of Indigenous representation long ago. The best way to do it today is to actually get those Indigenous people from the surrounding communities involved. If they don't have the knowledge, we have to supply them with those resources, but most of all, we have to continue to create those lasting relationships, those friendships, because the more we learn with one another about each other, the more similarities we find we have. Those differences seem to get put aside. At Fort Niagara, we often are representing 3 different time periods. So we do the French and Indian War, we do the American Revolution, and the War of 1812. Some of us try to dress in that Civil War clothes, but you know, nothing ever came up that far, so it's a little comical to me sometimes. Nonetheless, the Indigenous people, specifically the Haudenosaunee, really have a lot of influence on the development of the country, of the North American continent, because all of these, you know, water highways are in our backyard. So it really made those Indigenous people influential in the process, and the consumerism, I guess, as I like to call it, picks up. Now, as far as the Mohawk and the Seneca really being involved, the major parties, I guess, that are mentioned in our history books, we know that many of the other 6 nations are involved, but we know that the Seneca and the Mohawk are really the keepers of those boundaries, those borders, keepers of the eastern door, keepers of the western door. And long ago, at one point in history, if you went into the western part of this country, you were kind of forced, if not told, you need to go through the western door of the Seneca Nation, because they are the keepers into the interior of the country. Now, my father was a Seneca, I'm a Mohawk, and we would always joke about him wearing a certain coat and me wearing a red one. And some of the things he had said during his presentations, for instance, the Delaware kind of go and rage war, and the Haudenosaunee comes in, and my father would always say that we made women of the Delaware. And I kind of chuckled to myself as a kid because, as a kid, you don't think your parents know everything because, you're a kid, you know everything already. And it's one of the things that I chuckled at because the whole terminology of that, to make women of the Delaware, I didn't understand it at that point in my life. But within the past 6 years, I'm sitting back and I get to read those papers from William Johnson, from Gage, and those terms are directly used in those writings from the 1700s. So it kind of solidified the fact that the oral history the Native people are teaching, are telling our children and our friends and relatives, it's right on the money because I can go into documentation and I could find those same exact words. So I can correlate these stories of our oral history to the words that are written down by the ancestors, the English, the Dutch, the French, who arrived here so many years ago. At Fort Niagara, we really like to really pump the fact that this Clinton and Sullivan campaign took place because in our neck of the woods, you don't hear anything about Clinton and Sullivan at all when you're talking about the American Revolution. We hear about Loyalists, we hear about Tories, we hear about patriots, we hear about some Indigenous involvement, but it's never on the good side, I guess you can say. And that, again, in itself is perspective, right? The perspective is all what we want to tell. So we need to get the Native perspective out there. Not only are we involved in all these major conflicts, but we are involved on both sides of these major conflicts. We're involved in a civil war, from the French and Indian War all the way up through the War of 1812. And it just seems like every 25 or so years, we're trying to come back together. Again, we are forcibly chosen. We forcibly have to choose a side. And I think we were choosing the lesser of two evils, right? We got the short end of the stick either way. Now, one of the things I emphasize about that Clinton and Sullivan campaign is the writings that those soldiers have in their journals. The things we know of Native people living in the wilderness at that point in our history in the 1770s, it's not too far away from the way everybody else is living within their own community, trying to have that log cabin, trying to raise your family, your wife, your daughter, your son, maybe your in-law. Because already by the 1770s, Haudenosaunee people are living in that type of family situation. We are no longer living solely specifically in those extended houses, in those extended clan families. We already kind of absorbed some of that cultural difference, and we start living in those nuclear families as well. Currently at Fort Niagara right now, we don't have an interpretation place for myself to do the Native interpretation out of, but we know that in 1779, after that Clinton and Sullivan campaign, that those refugees that show up, Molly Brant is built a beautiful, beautiful hewn log cabin because of the importance of our clan mothers in the peace and war times. Not only was she built this beautiful cabin, but we know that there were more than one of these cabins built, and also they were called the Indian Barracks. So we know for a fact that those Native people were right there at that time. So it's given us the opportunity with this big celebration coming up. It's given us the opportunity to present not only our story as Indigenous people, as Haudenosaunee people, but many other Indigenous people throughout the Great Lakes. They're involved in all of these places. Not just the Munsing, just not the Delaware here, but we got to think about all of the Mohican, maybe the Mi'kmaq from up north, maybe the 7 nations of the St. Lawrence. We don't even mention all of those. There's more than just what we get to tell about, what I get to tell about. Now, what I get to do at my job really is I dress the part, I act the part, because I am the part. One of the hardest things to do, getting Native interpreters, is finding those Natives to actually do that. And that's why I said one of the most important things is to have these opportunities, these maybe workshops for Indigenous people from around our surrounding communities to come in and sit down, and that way we can network. We can learn who those individuals are that have that knowledge, those knowledge keepers, but also it's very important that we pull the language in as well, because that language doesn't only connect me to the earth, it connects me to the way my ancestors seen 300, 400 years ago. Now the story that I'm telling isn't only from the perspective of today, it's also using those old words and the perspective of my ancestors and the way they seen the world and how it was working. Now, one of the things I also emphasize is us Natives, we were trading for the finer things in life. And I've walked around this building, it's my first time here. It's a beautiful house, beautiful display downstairs. But it also mentions the finer things in European society is what those native leaders are going to be given. Now, granted, we're going to have those warriors who are wearing those plain work shirts, check shirts, things like that. But when we're at the fort, we're always talking about peace and war and the delegations that take place. During the 1777 American Revolution, these things are taking place as well, but we don't mention how often they're taking place. We always talk about the conflict, the strife, the struggle, but we never talk about what leads up to that actually happening. And at Fort Niagara, we emphasize the importance of the wampum belt, the peace treaty making, and how wampum diplomacy is and still should be the law of the land here. Many of the beautiful items you see here, we don't have the opportunity to really put on display at Old Fort Niagara. So what I do is I throw everything in a pack basket and I walk around. A lot like you would have probably seen Indigenous people doing right here when this place was first developed. We're going to have a bunch of goods and we're going to make those great relationships. And I'm going to explain to those visitors what I have, what we used to use, but also how it's progressed and what we're doing today. People don't realize that the things such as a needle and thread, a brass kettle changes the social structure of the Indigenous people relatively quickly. Already mid-1500s, we're kind of dependent on all of those goods. Why? Because we like the finer things in life. But also, those technological advances are making our lifestyle easier. They're making us able to create beautiful, beautiful articles of clothing, not only in those good-looking browns and tans of leather, but now we have the calicos that become so popular. We have the wools, we have the Chinese silk, we have the beads and materials coming from Italy and the Czech area. So not only does it put the native people on this grand scale of trading here, it lets us trade all across the globe. And some of those materials that we are getting, we're not utilizing them in the fashion that they're intended for. Like the earrings, the nose bobs, I mean, those are all from the reins of horses. But the native perspective of it, we say, wow, that shines in the light. I don't have anything like that. But also it's a status symbol. If I'm acquiring these goods, then you know that I'm wheeling and dealing. I'm somebody of importance, and that's how it was long ago. My wife, she also partakes in, my craziness at the fort. Sometimes we are, stationary in a building, but a lot of the times we are kind of roaming around because we try to keep it as accurate as we can, as historically accurate. And at Old Fort Niagara, there would have been no natives inside those walls at all. So really what we're doing with our hewn log cabin is we're placing it out in the front. A lot like this is set up here, the timeline. That's what we're trying to keep on lock and key because it's really important that we tell the story the way we need to tell it, but in the correct order as well. So the first thing you'll be able to see coming to Fort Niagara is that perspective of the Indigenous people. It's going to be a place that we can supply community members from our surrounding Indigenous communities with a place to demonstrate, a place to sell their wares, a place to really just talk to the people that are walking around the world who are oblivious to the fact that we still exist. I don't know how many times I've got told that, Indians exist east of the Mississippi, and I thought, oh yeah, we've been here for a long time. I was in Walmart behind that guy buying my groceries, But another thing that I emphasize about it is we have to have guys like myself, people who are positive-minded people. They are able to speak in a public setting. But also we need people that are willing to learn. We need people that are willing to admit that they don't know everything, and they're willing to come down and sit down, learn from somebody who they may not think has a lot to offer, but realizing that when we sit down together, we share the knowledge that we have, we all become powerful that way. We all strengthen ourselves, we strengthen the things that we're trying to do, meeting in places like this, and really connecting and making those that networking happen. Because there's a couple places that I intend to be in, it's because I've came and I've met you people in different historic places. Now, Fort Niagara, we don't have a huge Native interpretation department. Right now, it's just me. But I often say maybe that's all we need right now, because within the last 5 years, I've got this building up and going, and the state is right on board, and this is a project they've been working on for 23 years. 23 years is a long time to build a house. Especially when you have those native people right from your backyards working on site with you. It took a little bit of elbow grease, a little bit of shoving to my executive director, but we got the ball going, and all it took was for somebody to get in that position and say, hey, I'm the squeaky wheel, grease me. Because that's what we all have to do. We all have to voice our opinions, our concerns, And we got to say them to each other, but also to the right people. Because together, collectively, we're going to make things happen. We're going to change the way we educate, the way history is talked about right here in New York State, not only through the historic sites, but we're given the opportunity for these schools to come in, for adults to come in, demonstrations, programmings, they're all learning opportunities. And that's one of the things I emphasize at Fort Niagara. Not only just having interpreters come in, but you need to have Native people portraying themselves. If we don't have Native people coming to partake, you're gonna always have to maybe find some funds. Because that's one of the things we are not doing, opposed to some of our other interpretive friends, is that we are not reenactors. We are not playing a role. I do not do a first-person perspective ever. I just let people know that we are Haudenosaunee, we are Ongwe. This is how we are. This is what we need to do. Now, if we have to, I guess, lack of better terms, supply some funds, time is money. And a lot of these people, they're not doing these types of things on a grand scale. Some of them are just locally at home, family members, son, daughter, nephew, grandkids, things like that. So we literally have to look into having funds, having the opportunity to bring communities from outside our own, bring natives from those communities, and pay them for their time. Because we are not pretending. We are not acting. It's no difference than if you had a white guy play a black guy. Blackface, it's the same thing. And that's one of the things I believe a lot of our reenactors are having an issue with, is that they want to be an Indian. And that's great and all, because, I'm a Mohawk, it's great. Wonderful thing. But guess what? I'm still just a human being. And I would never go somewhere and tell somebody that I'm an Italian, that I'm Polish, if I'm dressed that way. That's one of the things that I emphasize the most, is that we tell the story the right way, and our educators who are helping us are reminded that education is the first part of why we're doing this, to get the correct story out there so that way people don't have these misperceptions of who Indigenous people are. Now, there's a way to still dress as a Native and not be a Mohawk or a Munsee or an Onondaga. There's a great tale that comes with that captive scenario. Now, many leaders of the Haudenosaunee people and many other nations around us, we weren't all full-blooded. We think of Corn Planter, whose father was a Dutchman. We think of Mary Jemison, who became the Wolf clan mother to Seneca Nation, blonde-haired, blue eyes, taken from her family as a child. So these are great ways to tell these stories of why somebody who is not of Native American descent to be dressed the way they are. It's one of the things that I've thought about for a couple years now, because this is something that really has hit our reenacting community throughout the nation, is this portrayal of Indian people, of Native people by non-Natives. And I don't want to exclude anybody, because guess what? We need those numbers. We need those people. For instance, you can't have the French and Indian War, even though, it's between the British and the French. But you can't have the French and Indian War without having the Natives there. You got to have at least a couple, One of the best ways to do that is just maybe reaching out to those communities. Maybe reaching out to me, who I can possibly connect you with people from those surrounding communities. Because this thing that I do here, I don't just do it in the 18th century setting. I do this contemporarily. I travel the world and I educate through song and dance, through storytelling, and I get to wear regular clothes sometimes when I do that. So it's part of who I am, but it's also part of who many of our Native community members are as well. We have language holders, we have knowledge holders, we have wampum keepers, we have faith keepers, we have clan mothers, we have chiefs, and a lot of these people show interest at Fort Niagara and what we're doing there, just so we can tell our side of that story. I don't always like to focus on that Revolutionary War, even though we're here for that. Because at the fort, we like to talk about the refugee and how many bad things happen. And all I can say is I'm not putting on tattered clothes, because I'm a well-established Mohawk Roskerageti. I'm a warrior. So I'm going to dress to the T's every chance I get. There's no reason that we need to focus on all of that negativity. We can talk about it, but our story should include that. It shouldn't just be about that. We shouldn't say, hey, those Native guys left with nothing on their back. How do you think we were dressed? Oftentimes I will bring a piece of canvas, and I'll let children hold this piece of canvas, because that's what the Rangers had to offer those native people that showed up to Fort Niagara. And that winter's coming, so we know that just about 10,000 refugees are out of the doors, the gates there of Fort Niagara. About 5,000 or so of them are natives, pushed out of their homes in New York State. The rest of them, Loyalists, people that didn't want to get involved. It didn't matter if it was your brother and he wasn't a Loyalist and you were, you guys were fighting. It was a wild, wild time. The wild, wild west, I refer to that. Who'd have thought Western New York, the wild, wild west, right? But we don't want to focus on the negativity of what we look like, because there was so much more to who we were as people, who we are as people. Still to this day, we talk about that time. And I always try to find all this negativity with a learning opportunity, something that I can twist it and make it a positive. So we have this Clinton and Sullivan campaign that takes place, and they burn everything they're told to burn. Anything that can sustain life, from the wild bushes that have that berry to all of the corn we harvested into the corn that is still in the fields. So they burn everything. What do? We're pretty good at bobbing and weaving with the punches, you know. We take a little bit of what we can, some of that charred, burnt corn. And it's one of the delicacies a lot of our community members love to this day, is roasted corn soup. But it's because we don't even know in our own communities that derives from that rough time during the American Revolution, during the time where they burned everything that we owned, everything that we possessed, everything that kept us healthy, strong, safe from the elements. They burned it all. Now, I luck out because I'm a Mohawk, and everybody always asks me at the fort why I have the red coat on, and I get to explain to them, well, the Mohawk, we side with the British just about through all of these major conflicts. But that also gives me the opportunity to tell them how many other nations are choosing the side of our enemies there, I guess you could say. Even though the Mohawk are in that Confederacy, we're still in that civil war with each other, trying to stay neutral. So I think bringing the whole American Revolution, what I like to say is bringing it to Fort Niagara, we're going to try to get away from that really, really dark time. We want people to be dressed to the T's, because it really is a celebration. It's a commemoration of everybody coming together, but we got to learn from all of this stuff, and that's why we do what we do, because we want to learn, and we want to make sure none of that stuff ever happens again. And the best way I know how to do that is by getting educated. So coming to Fort Niagara, we give the Native American kids in our communities the opportunity to come and learn from a different perspective, a different aspect of the history they're going to have in the schooling system. But also, me and my peers, we meet with the school districts. So what we focus on there is going to coincide with what they're learning in school, but also we're definitely going to tell them a little bit more, because I know for a fact, from my own personal experience, the things that you should learn in the history book, they're going to skim right over them, and we're going to focus on those things that make, you know, some things look better than they are. And really, that's not what we're trying to do. We got to tell that whole story. That's why I love that saying, tell the whole story, right? The whole history. My history starts before yours, but it turns into our history. So with that, Jagonsa say that great law. You know, it's the women, I always say, that kept our culture and our community so strong. It's not just because our bloodlines pass matrilineally through our mothers, but it's because I think they realized really, really early on that the game and the war was going to change from the physical to the now go sit in your seat and get educated. And that's what the Indigenous people are starting to do now. Our leaders aren't just leaders in our own communities, they're leaders in your community as well. They're lawyers, they're judges, they're doctors. Some of them are EMTs. My mom's an awesome RN. She runs the emergency room back home. But it's one of the things that I think giving people the opportunity to see the Native the way they should be seen. The peaceful, the beautiful, the love and culture that we still have today. Because all of our people are like that. For everywhere you go around the world, not just Native people. The underlying lesson of all of our wampum treaties is that we need to be kind, loving, courteous, and respectful of one another's differences and similarities. That's what those wampum belts are. The one they have downstairs that Muncie made with the Dutch here, same concept. The British thought the same thing with the Haudenosaunee. When they took over this colony from the Dutch there, they said, hey, that's a good concept you guys had with them. That, as he called it, the covenant chain, right? He takes the rope and gets rid of that, because that rope will break down over time. Keep polishing that silver, and that's what we need to do as educators, as I guess members in this field, we need to make sure those chains stay polished, that those relationships between all of us, we stay connected, we can work together towards a common goal with a good mind, and great things are going to happen. I guess that's it. That's my whole perspective, I guess. I wanted to make a slide, a show, but honestly, when you come to my site, and I'm inviting you all to come to Fort Niagara, come during the spring, though. We're open all year, but it gets pretty cold on Lake Ontario during these cold months. Oh, yeah, hey, that's me. So the one on the left, like I said, I always wear that red coat. It's one of the times I get to show off. You know, a nice little red officer's coat. That coat I actually got, it was in that show Turn, which I thought was pretty cool. So I got that coat from the guy that developed those for the program. And then you have me on the right, a little more of an 1812-ish looking shirt there. But again, when you start learning, that's one of the things I learned, is that these calico material shirts, these block print shirts, certain things are being developed just for the Indigenous people. And I didn't really understand that until I actually went to Fort Niagara, and I got to look at those trade lists. I got to look at all that documentation. This one's at the Museum of the American Revolution. I helped down there with their exhibit. The Oneida Nation really put a big donation into that museum. And if you go down there, we have a few of our interpreters from Niagara that are in there as mannequins, but also the music in the Oneida exhibit. Me and my buddies are the ones singing on that. So when I say I bring a song and a dance to what I do, that's quite literally how I start everything. Everything that I started doing as far as presentations has always started with a song and a dance. And the first time I gave a talk about who I am, where I come from, I was in 2nd grade. And it was during Thanksgiving time, because that's when you learned about the Native Americans. But my mother got our clothes together. I laid a table out of material culture, water drums, rattles, moccasins, other clothing, feathered headdresses, and we put on a tape because I didn't know how to sing at that point in time. So we put on a tape and we did some demonstrations, and I'm 43 now, and I have good friends from that time, and they still remember that. They still remember getting up and doing our smoke dance with me, which is a celebration dance. But they remember that, and I think that's one of the aspects that Native culture and other cultures, when you bring those people there to your site, people will retain that because they don't often get that experience. You know, I don't think any of my friends have ever done a Native dance after that. It is one of the most difficult ones that they had to try. But again, you know, that's one of the ways I think this is the field that I'm supposed to be in one way or another. Because at a young age, I knew who I was, I knew where I came from, and I knew that we needed to be nice to each other. But we also needed to share our stories. And as a kid, you don't get that very often. I'm sure a few of us have had one kid here and there that really impressed us. We were talking about it earlier. There's always, you know, somebody that really sticks out like a sore thumb. And in our communities, we don't really have that much going on in this historic field, this interpretation, because we look at it as an interpretation. When we put our akwenya unwe on, our native clothes, it's for a very special occasion. So it takes a lot of our community members a little bit of encouragement, a little bit of pushing forward to even say, hey, let's dress like we used to do. Because it took me about, 2 weeks to get used to that breech clout and that long shirt. But I'd never had the wind blow up at me like that either. So that could have been what it was from. But I'm one of the most comfortable guys all summer. I'm not really wearing pants, but people don't know that. Unless I tell them, right? But these are the things that we don't think about it from the Native perspective. How comfortable are we walking around with our, skies out, thighs out? That's what we say. I get the weirdest tan, a triangle on my foot from my moccasin, and then a half crescent moon on my thigh from my legging and my shirt. But that is the style that we wore long ago. And once our people, our indigenous people realize that, they start to get away from being afraid. Because guess what? They're now learning something. The more we know about something, the less afraid we are to face that, right? Even when we do our dance presentations, we invite all of the spectators up, as many that can come up as we can. And it's one of the things I emphasize is that's why we do what we do, to get you out of your comfort zone, to get you to try something different, but also to remind you that that's how life is. If you get comfortable, well, you better probably find something else to do, because it's not going to cut it after a while. The language is a big part of what I bring to my interpretation as well. So if you get a chance to bring Indigenous people in, I always say look for those language speakers, because those are going to be your elders, they're going to be your knowledge keepers, they're going to be the ones that hold all that traditional cultural knowledge. You can always bring them in and offer them, information. Here, take these resources, read them, and make your own judgment out of it. Because that's what I did. I have all the cultural background, but I didn't have any of that historic military background of really what went on. And that's what keeps me, honestly, doing what I do, because I'm learning so much stuff. We all know how it is. You have one question, you look it up, and you didn't even find your answer because you had 20 more questions that came in. So we're always learning. We're always open at Fort Niagara as well. We try to emphasize to our communities that if they want to come down, even just set up or check things out, they're allowed to do that. We had an Indigenous festival the past 2 years where we had a smoke dance competition. It's a very high energetic dance for the Haudenosaunee people. It's pretty popular. I took it to Indio, California. I sang it in Mashantucket, Pequot. So you can see this song and dance done from coast to coast. But also we're doing it there now, and it's a good way to bring back those Indigenous people because we were there to begin with. And a lot of the people that have issues with any of the interpretation that goes on, all I can do is invite them out. And that's the best thing we can do. If they have an issue with it, invite them out. We can sit down and we can have something to eat and we can talk about it and we can hash those out, because that's how the Native people are. If people are going to portray us, we want them to do the best job they're going to do. Because I know there are some great reenactors out there that are non-Native guys, and I wouldn't be able to tell unless I knew them. From across the battlefield, they look the part. And then you walk up and you talk to them and they got a Hoboken accent. You can tell where they're from. But also, that's another good opportunity to teach about that captive scenario, that adoption process that takes place. There is so much documentation on that. If you can't find documentation on being captured as a Native, you're not looking hard enough. Or you didn't ask the right person. Because it's out there. There's books on it, complete books on it. One of the resources I use that I always push on anybody that's trying to do Native interpretation, Their Baron is Noble and Proud, books 1 and 2. All it is descriptions of what people see Native people wearing. Floating down the Hudson, floating down the Susquehanna, sitting on the riverbanks. Heck, so I was surprised that sometimes they're wearing nothing at all. But on a hot day, long ago, you're living in the woods. That's how it was. I got a friend that still cuts his grass in a birthday suit. But he lives way in the woods. He ain't going to see anybody. Thank God. But again, create these opportunities for these communities, members from the Native communities to come to your site. Send an invitation. Long ago, what we would do is we would send runners. They'd have wampum. And they would show up with a stick, and there'd be these little notches, these hash marks on that stick, and it lets you know when this meeting is going to take place. How many sleeps are you going to have until you got to show up? Now, sometimes these leaders, these people are walking for quite some time. Let's say Akwesasne Mohawk on the St. Lawrence to the western door of the Seneca. That's quite a trip. So what we have to do is we have to show that hospitality as well, because that's how we're supposed to be as human beings, to take care of one another. When you travel and you're tired, we want you to rest. We want you to wash up, shower. We want you to eat, fill your belly, because when we sit down to handle our business, it's very important, and we need you at 100% capacity. So we shouldn't be thinking of it any other way. The same way it was 300, 400, 500 years ago, we need to approach it the same way, with peace, with respect, and gratitude. And we need to invite these surrounding nations, not just the 6 nations, but all of these nations that are around everywhere. Because you got to think up here, this trade route, these Mohawk are coming out here. We are going to the Carolinas. We're getting shell gorgets that are coming from the Gulf Coast. So this trade route, we have been all over. And we need to continue doing that as well. So once again, that's my time. I think really what I wanted to emphasize is connecting with those surrounding Indigenous communities. Look for, in Buffalo and Niagara counties, we have what is known as Native American Community Services. So look into, organizations such as that, and they can connect you if you don't already have those connections with those surrounding communities. And just like today, I mean, I'm from, Western New York. Most Indigenous people, we are willing to travel far and wide, especially the ones that do this type of thing, to educate, to share who we are, but most of all, to create great relationships so we can live on this earth as beautiful as we can. So that's my time. Thank you very much. And Yamagoa, I appreciate your listening to what I have to say.